A lot of things can go wrong if black player that plays the Caro-Kann is not prepared against the two knights. e4, c6, and then knight c3, d5, and knight f3. So these are the two knights. Now there's plenty of options, and this is just the first video, but we're going to cover all of them. After knight f3, and now it's black to move, instead of bishop g4, we're going to go through this, d4. This is unusual in a way that, well, it's just wrong, but it does happen a lot. A lot of players play it. The pawn is defended by the queen, so this knight can't take the pawn, so the knight will have to move again, and black might think of controlling more squares in the center and gain some space on the queen side. So after knight to e2, now we're doubling the attack on the pawn. Black cannot defend with e5 simply because it gets taken, so after c5, it looks like black's got some control of the center, but black will immediately target it with a pawn. So c3, and now there's three attackers to this square. What happens after d3? Well, this is already losing. The knight moves to f4, and now there's two attackers to d3 and only one defender. So if black defends it with the pawn, then the game goes on with queen a4 check. How to block this? Either with the bishop or with the knight or with the queen. In any case, the queen will be taking this pawn, and then the white player will also win the other pawn, and white will be up 2 pawns already in the beginning. So for example, knight c6, queen takes pawn, and after e5, attacking the knight, the only thing black can do to try and get some compensation out of this is to go for a quicker development, put the pawn in the center, attack the knight, maybe win the tempo or something. But now knight d5 simple. The knight doesn't need to go to d3, because after knight to d3, the black player will just be winning maybe some tempos, and that's not ideal. So after knight to d5, bishop e6, maybe attacking the knight, and the queen will just take the pawn, getting out of the diagonal of the bishop. White is up 2 pawns, there's no compensation whatsoever. Let's say just a few more moves. Bishop developing to d6, and now queen to c2. Of course, the goal is eventually to play d4, not right now, but after knight to f6, the black player's only thing to do is to develop as quick as possible, so that when you're down material, like you're down 2 pawns, the least you can do is develop as soon as possible and see if you can start an attack. Otherwise, if the game goes quiet, then you just have a pretty big disadvantage. So after knight to f6, white just develops the last piece. Of course, white did waste a few tempos to capture the pawns, so it needs to speed up the development. Bishop c4 is just fine. Trading right now will be fantastic for white. And after castling, then let's just trade. Knight to f6, and then queen takes f6. Of course, you don't want to break the pawn structure in front of the king. Bishop takes bishop. And now black doesn't want to isolate the pawns, and if he were to do so, then that's just fine for us. So queen e6, and now after d3 and in castle, black player has got absolutely nothing. The knight's got nowhere amazing to go to. This bishop isn't any threatening at all, and white will just have to play a normal game, especially trying to trade pieces and just make use of the advantage. Back at that position after d4 and then knight e2 and c5, white will play c3. Now black can play knight to c6. This stops our check, and this means that the pawns are now threatening to go to d3 and c4 without worrying about being taken. In that case, it's pretty dangerous for white. So what to do now? Well, first of all, the goal of c3 is to take the pawn in d4. C takes, and then pawn takes, and now queen a4. We're pinning the knight, and we have 2 attackers here, so we're threatening to win that pawn. And e5 is not possible because this knight is pinned, so e5 is not protected. So now there's nothing that black can do because this pawn is actually going to be taken. It's inevitable. Let's say bishop d7. The knight in e is happily going to take this pawn in order to release the bishop. Of course, the knight in f3 was just doing fine. We don't have to worry about any discovered attack because we will just remove the queen, and white goes on with an advantage from the start. If instead black were to try and counterplay like knight f6, attacking this pawn, then still the knight can take, and this counterattack doesn't really work because after knight e4, then the knight will just take in c6. So black had to do something about the c6 square. So going back just a few moves, after knight f6, the idea of the counterplay might be supported by bishop d7. So after knight takes the pawn, the knight might try not to go for this pawn yet and just offer more protection to the c6 square whilst developing. Well, even in that case, the knight will just take and give black an isolated pawn and keep the pawn advantage. After bishop c6, this double attack on the pawn is simply stopped by bishop b5. And now what does black play? Well, there's a double attack in here, so black will have to defend this pawn further. And after queen b6, there's going to be swaps. so white will just keep a safe pawn advantage. Queen takes, and then we'll just take back, and what if pawn takes, then again white's got just completely fine advantage. After taking back, d3 defends the pawn, gets ready to castle. After e6 castle, well, black will just go on with development, but the queen is not really attacking this square, so the bishop can be developed to e3 with a tempo, because the black queen cannot go to b2 without losing this pawn and the game. So after, let's say, black tries something bishop c5 in order to make the bishop e3 move less effective, then we're going to play b4. The bishop cannot take the pawn because of rook b1 pinning it, and whenever the bishop can't go to d6 because of the fork, he will have to go to e7. So that was just a waste of time for black. And now bishop e3 comes. White will go on in the next moves to put more pressure on the isolated pawn with the rooks, and white is just completely fine in here. Going back at the starting position, after the usual Caro-Kann moves, now black continues with bishop g4, h3 now, and bishop h5. White needs to take the pawn in d5. This pawn cannot be recaptured by the queen, it will be recaptured by the pawn, and now g4. So now the bishop will have to go to the only available square, which is g6. What happens after this weird variation? Black can try d4. It is a possibility. It's not very usual, but it is a possibility. So let's just quickly go through it. After d4, white takes the bishop, and of course black takes the piece. Obviously we have to take with the side pawn in order not to get a trade of queens or anything like that, and this is going to be able to reinforce the center. So now black has got many options. Let's see, knight f6 in order to go for this pawn, and white continues with this plan, rook to b1, attacking the pawn. So this is already an attempt of infiltrating the rooks. The next move are going to be something like, all of these moves are possible and absolutely fine. Bishop g2 will put more pressure on it, queen e2, and after knight e5, something like queen f3 as well. We're going to put a lot of pressure on this b7 square, since the light square bishop of the opponent is gone. So after, let's say, queen to c7, just to make an example, but the moves are going to be pretty much the same. Knight to d4. The idea is to play bishop g2, super strong move. So after, let's say, black plays e5, bishop g2 is so strong that the knight can be left in d4. The bishop g2 here is threatening to take b7 and win the rook, so that's a price we're willing to pay for the knight. So after bishop g2 and knight c6, the white player is already winning the game with rook to b7, an attack on the queen. If the queen were to take the rook, then bishop c6 will end the game, and of course the queen wouldn't be able to move away, because again this will be a check and it will be just a disaster and the game is over already. So here we are back at the same position of this weird variation of the d4 move. After knight to f6 going for the pawn, rook to b1. What if black defends it with the queen? Black defends b7 with the queen. Then knight to e5. The idea is still to put pressure on the c6 square and put the queen in f3 as soon as possible. So let's say black tries something different. Let's say black tries to get this rook out of this very dangerous diagonal, especially because the light square bishop is about to become super strong. And also this is an idea, potential idea. Let's say black plays a6 in order to stop the bishop check in b5 and also to put the rook in a7. In this type of idea, white has another piece that can do the same thing as the bishop, so that's the queen to f3, and after rook to a7, getting the rook out of danger, at least for the moment, and protecting b7 a little bit further, white now can simply win with queen e3. So this idea doesn't work. The queen's attacking the rook will have to move, and after bishop g2, this is a massive problem. Can black solve it? Well, no, because we've seen this pattern before. Knight to c6 is met by rook b7, and all the excellent tactics after. And well, if the rook doesn't go back to a8 and black just develops the knight, which is defending the rook, well then that's very simple. Couldn't be simpler than that. Bishop takes knight, removes the defender, and then the queen wins the rook. So back at the position we are analyzing in this line. What if after knight to f6, then rook to b1, black protects with b6, well, this looks even worse. Now this comes with bishop b5. This is a check, and how can black stop it? Well, black needs to keep developing as well. A move like knight d7 is very passive and is met by knight e5. Or if this knight goes to d7, developing and probably getting the rook to a more useful square, this move is also met by knight e5 and then queen f3 and so on. So after knight e5 here, there's a lot of pressure and on the knight, but black doesn't have to worry immediately because we still can't take the knight, but we are going to create some pressure. Queen f3, for example, has a very simple idea. Queen f3 comes with a threat in f7, which means that bishop takes knight will force, well, black wouldn't be able to take with the queen because then knight wins queen, and if white takes if the black knight takes back, then the queen has got access to f7. So queen f3 is a very threatening move. So in order to release the pressure, let's say black plays a6. Then the bishop just stays on the same diagonal, bishop to c6. Rook to a7 offers more protection to this knight, so the move a6 was absolutely comprehensible. Queen f3 comes anyway, the threat remains. White is at least threatening to win the exchange. Now the goal of the white player will be, black were to play perfectly, the goal of the white player will be c4 and then bishop to d2 and then bishop to d4, putting more pressure on the square b6. It looks like a very slow plan, but it's inevitable. So let's see what black could try to do in this case. Queen c7 with an attack on the knight, development of the queen, how to continue. d4, put the pawn in the center and defend the knight. All very obvious. And now white can leave this amazing knight right in the middle. The king will not be able to get out of the pin because of knight a7 winning a rook. So black will have to try and develop. Let's see e6. Black will dream to be able to castle and get out of all of this trouble, but it's just too late because white's development is amazing. After e6, this is an example of what we said before. Bishop takes the knight, and well, the queen can't take back, but after this knight goes to d7, queen takes f7 check, the king goes to d8. Now there's going to be a check by the bishop, and well, the game is going to be over soon. If knight f6, bishop takes, comes with check, wins a piece. If pawn takes back, then queen takes f6, wins the rook. And if the king were to move, then queen here check, and king moves again. And now we're just winning a piece with the queen, or probably even with the knight. That would be even better. So let's not go any further. Something else that needs to be noticed is that e6 that was literally just tried a minute ago, followed by the whole disaster in f7. So after g6, black may try bishop g7, but that fails for the exact same reason. White will just castle, and bishop g7 fails to bishop takes. So knight takes, queen f7, same disaster, maybe even worse. So now, after knight to f6, rook to b1, what happens if black decides to give up the pawn and get some development, like knight to c6? Well, the rook takes, and after rook to b8, the idea may be to take back with the queen after a swap and continue the game. Well, this is met by bishop b5, and there's an attack on the knight. Well, if the rook takes, then we're just going to win piece. Right, back at the same position. Earlier, we've been going through a few lines with knight f6. What happens if black doesn't play knight f6, but rather e6? Well, nothing changes because rook b1, and the position is going to be the same. We got the threats of bishop b5, bishop g2, and then the knight to e5, queen f3, and we're going to go for the weakness. Let's see what happens after black tries to get some development, like knight to c6, rook takes b7, and there's no swap happening because after rook to b8, bishop comes to d5 with an attack on the knight, and the rook will not be able to take the other rook because then white will win a piece. If the knight gets protected by the knight in e7, well, then just very simple, rook takes e7 comes with check, and the knight will not be able to take because it's pinned. White is winning 2 knights for rook and is going to be up in material, and also has got 2 bishops and a much better position. So back at the position, after e6, rook to b1. What if black plays something like queen to d7? Now bishop to g2, we're already hitting on this pawn. Knight to c6 is the only move that makes sense really, because the knight is threatening to leave, go to e5 with an attack on the queen, whilst the bishop will trap the rook. So knight to c6 kind of protects the e5 square and also stops a direct threat on the b7 square. Now white will castle. The idea is to play d4 and then knight e5. So what happens after rook to d8? This is another potential idea, putting the queen and the rook on the same file, getting the rook out of danger and trying to play a decent game. This setup with moving the c pawn, the d pawn, and then having to move the knight c6 and giving away the light square bishop means that there's going to be dangers around the queen side area, and so the king side is going to be left out for a bit, and they're not going to be, these pieces just so useless at the moment, whereas the white pieces are all fully able to enter the game. Now white goes on with knight d4. The threat right now is the usual, rook takes pawn, and that comes with an attack on the queen, and then there's going to be 2 pieces attacking c6, and it's going to be game over. So if black takes the knight, which looks like the more logical move, well, then rook b7 comes anyway. And what can black do? The rook is protected by the bishop, so black will have to save the queen. And after saving the queen, wherever the queen goes, white will simply recapture the knight. And so white is up a pawn, and it's got a tremendous rook and a threat of bishop c6, which looks deadly. And also with the potential arrival of the bishop in a3, if the king were to move to a dark square. So that means the knight cannot take the knight in d4. So let's go back a few moves. After knight to d4, if black plays another developing move, like knight to e7, the reason is it's important to offer more protection for this knight. So knight f6, for example, will fall into this usual thing of the rook b7 and the double attack on c6. So knight e7, and the idea is that if white takes, then the black knight can take back. Then again, white just takes. And after knight takes back, white comes with this brilliant move, queen g4. The idea is to stop the black the black bishop from developing because of an attack on g7, and also get the rook to e1, and then moves like d4, d5 are coming. The bishop will be protecting d5, and the rook will be pinning the pawn in e6. And why is it that this plan that seems to be slow is also super effective? It's because the black bishop will not be able to develop and black will not be able to castle. So what if black tries to develop the bishop from the fianchetto? So g6 for instance. Then d4, simple, and bishop g7. Black is one step away from castling. White goes on with a threat. Bishop to g5, attacking the rook. Well, the rook will have to move now. A move like f6 will be pointless. But okay, let's look at it just for a second. The move now is h6. The reason is very simple. We're willing to double up our opponent's pawns because we're going to take the bishop anyway. Well, if the bishop moves away, then bishop f6 wins the game. If black takes the bishop, then we take the opponent bishop. The rook will have to move, or the queen take. If the queen takes, we got queen e6. It's deadly. With the rest of the pieces coming, the bishop will be able to take the knight, the queen will win another pawn, the rook will infiltrate, the other rook comes with check. It's pointless to discuss. So what if black just moves the rook to g8? Well, then in that case, there you go. Rook to b7, usual threat. Queen can't take the rook because of queen e6, which wins the rook. And if, well, okay, let's look at it. Queen takes, queen e6, and if queen goes in between, then we even have some intermediate move. I don't know, I haven't really looked at this position personally because black is just supposed to resign, but this is like check, and then this, well, okay, it's pointless. What if knight e7? Well, then the queen is lost. So let's go back a few moves. Right, here we are after bishop g7 and bishop g5. The f6 move was really bad. What if the rook just moves away? Well, white continues with h6. The bishop will have to move, and after bishop to f8, bishop to f6, and rook to g8, white continues with d5. Now, as I say in every single video, I don't make these videos for the sake of memorizing stuff or memorizing lines or anything. All that's actually happening on the board is that in every setup, in every type of opening and defense, all of these patterns will be identified if you've happened to seen them before. We're not really claiming these exact lines that happen, but first of all, they will sometimes happen, actually more often than you think. And secondly, these patterns will be recurring, they will happen a lot, and once you've learned them, once you've seen them already, you'll be able to identify them when it happens again, when they happen again, because that's when somebody happens to play the Caro-Kann, whatever position you're in, all scenarios are going to look very similar to each other.